This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Okay, so I was asked to give a talk about the cremation ground. And when I started thinking about it, I thought, well, I have to really talk about it in the context of Padmasambhava. So I'll talk about Padmasambhava, who spent, it would appear, something like 40 years of his life meditating in 8 different cremation grounds in India as part of his training to become a bodhisattva. Which is quite a thought, really. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about Padmasambhava and how it came to be that he chose such a course of action. And all of my information this evening is going to be based on this text, which is called in English, The Life and Liberation of Padmasambhava. And it's an English translation of a French translation of a Tibetan text from the 14th century. And it's about this character, Padmasambhava, who some of you will be intimately acquainted with and some of you less so. So I will sort of say a few words about him by way of introduction. So this text was written in Tibet. Well, it wasn't written really. It was discovered by a Terton, who is a sort of discoverer of secret teachings, texts. So this was discovered by a Terton in Tibet called Urgyen Lingpa. And I'm not quite sure where he found it, perhaps in a cave or perhaps somewhere in the recesses of his mind. It came into being. But it wasn't actually written by him, he says. It was written by a woman called Yeshe Sogyal, who lived in the court of the Tibetan emperor in the 8th century. So we go back to the 8th century. And Yeshe Sogyal was the sort of one of the consorts of this character, Padmasambhava, who was a man who was born in India, actually, and towards the end of his life was invited to Tibet to help the Tibetans establish Buddhism in their country. And the reason he was invited was because he already had a reputation for knowing how to handle demons and monstrous creatures and dark, disruptive, chaotic forces. And a lot of his training took place in the cremation grounds of India. So the interesting thing about Padmasambhava is that he is actually a really historically existing person. He actually lived sometime during the 8th century. But he has become a totally mythic figure and revered as a bodhisattva. In fact, the Tibetans call him the second Buddha. They revere him so highly. And this text is a kind of a biography of Padmasambhava, told in extremely mythic terms. So the story goes that, the story that I'm going to tell about the birth of Padmasambhava takes place in a country called Udayana, which is situated in sort of the northwestern part of India, what actually we would now call Pakistan and the Swat Valley, a very beautiful part of the world. Back then, in the 8th century, it was called Udayana, and it had a king and a queen. The king's called Indrabhuti, and actually he was blind. He and his wife were kind of very well-meaning monarchs, I think you could say. I think they wanted to be good, conscientious rulers. But they were conscious that they lived, in a way, in fallen times. So the country of Udayana, you would find scattered around that country relics of an earlier time when there had been a truly great and enlightened monarch who'd actually presided over a huge empire that had stretched from Pakistan, what we now call Pakistan in the west, all the way to Bangladesh in the east and down to what we now call Orissa. And scattered across that territory, including Udayana, were relics of that time, sort of big pillars with edicts written on them and stupas, and every now and then a gem would appear, a fabulously wrought gem would appear. And it was clear that these were relics of a golden age, of a wheel-turning monarch who'd presided over a sort of a dharmic kingdom. And all of that had kind of been lost. There were just little memories of it. So in this period, Indrabhuti and his wife, they sort of yearned to have that kind of dharmic knowledge that would enable them to also turn the wheel of the Dharma, or at least give birth to a child who would become such a great monarch. But they had a child, but the child had died very young. So they were childless and rather sad as a consequence. And I could tell you a rather lovely story about how the blind king, Indrabhuti, went on a journey to find the Chintamani, the wish-fulfilling jewel. We haven't got time for that this evening. But he succeeded. And perhaps as a consequence of that, sometime later, a minister from his court was out on a sort of a hiking trip around the beautiful lake of Dharnakosha. And he was walking along and he saw in the lake, in a little sort of secluded inlet of the lake, he saw a remarkable sight, which was a tiny little child who seemed to have spontaneously sprung to life from between the petals of a lotus flower. And this minister was really struck by this and immediately had the intuition that this little boy was some kind of very positive omen, and he had to tell King Indrabhuti about it. So he went straight back to the court and said, I've seen this amazing thing on the lake at Dharnakosha. And it was this boy, and I'm sure it may have been a trick of the light, but it looked as though his skin was all the different colours of the rainbow. And he was a beautiful child just playing very happily on this lotus flower. But I think that he is some sort of good omen for you, King Indrabhuti. And Indrabhuti got very excited. They made a little expedition to Lake Dharnakosha, and he bowed down to this boy and said, "Why are you here? Do you have some kind of message for me?" And the little boy looked at Indrabhuti and said, My father is the knower of knowledge. My mother is the queen of emptiness. I love clarity and perplexity, and I'm here for the benefit of all beings. And King Indrabhuti said, will you come back to the palace and be my son? And the boy said, okay, I'll do that. So King Indrabhuti takes Padmasambhava, which means born from a lotus, back to the palace and brings him up as his own son. So Padmasambhava has the finest education you can imagine, physical, mental, ethical. He is brought up to be, a very fine young man. And King Indrabhuti and his wife are absolutely devoted to him. He's extremely handsome, very clever, extremely brave. He seems to be everything they could possibly wish for, and he's certainly going to make a very great king. But then adolescence hits, and Padmasambhava starts, to get the telltale sort of bum fluff on his chin. And his hair starts to get greasy and lanky, and he starts wearing clothes that don't suit him. And he starts to sort of grunt a little bit rather than say anything. And he becomes extremely sort of morose and difficult, basically. And he starts walking around with a vajra in one hand and this weird thing called a katvanga in the other, which he's got there. And Indrabhuti and the Queen are hoping that it's just going to be a bit of a phase. But the truth is that Padmasambhava has been having dreams, and Vajrasattva has been coming to Padmasambhava in his dreams and saying, your destiny is not to be the king of Udayana. It's your destiny to become a Dharmaphara, to become a Bodhisattva. That is a far more glorious and satisfying destiny for you. And so Padmasambhava is in one of those classic sort of binds. He realizes that sooner or later he's just going to have to make the break and leave the family home. It's going to be very, very, very difficult because they don't want to let him go. Who would? Even when he's going through this awful adolescent phase. So he realizes that actually he's going to have to take drastic action. And I'm kind of truncating the story a little bit here. But ultimately, he ends up on the roof of the royal palace dancing with his vajra in one hand and his katvanga in the other. And he does a wild and crazy dance. And at the climax of the dance, he lets go of the vajra, and it strikes a young boy in the head and kills him. And then he lets go of the katvanga, and it pierces the heart of a woman, and she drops down dead. Everybody is aghast and horrified, and the people of Udayana demand justice. So King Indrabhuti has absolutely no option. It's either that his son will be executed or he will be exiled. So the king decides to exile his son, which of course, in a way, is what Padmasambhava wants. Although he loves his parents, as they have become to him, he knows that actually this is what he's got to do. And there's a fabulous speech that he gives at this point in the book. So I thought I would read that speech out to you. So it's called The Renunciation of the Kingdom of Udayana. And this is what Padmasambhava, who's beginning to get the hang of the Dharma already through these dreams that he's been having from Vajrasattva. This is what he says to his parents to sort of help them get used to the fact that he's leaving. What was united, for lack of being stable, is sundered. The momentary condition is breaking up. Kings and great men are dispersed like crowds in the marketplace. In all the worlds, there is no law of permanence. All die, thus losing the body which was theirs. The 5 aggregates assembled are broken up. Human life advances without ever stopping. All deeds are accomplished without being fixed. What we value does not go with us into death. Relatives do not go with us into death. Riches accumulated do not go with us into death. Neither beauty or jewels go with us into death. Since we must wander alone in an unknown land, consider respectfully if all this is real. As for me, having sought the Dharma of the great vehicle, soon, O Mother, O Father, I will reveal a supreme Buddha. Meditate on this auspicious word and give comfort to your hearts. So King Indrabhuti and his queens very tearfully let Padmasambhava go. And the first thing he does is he spends a week in retreat, chanting the refuges and precepts. And then he begins his first sojourn in the cremation ground. First cremation ground that he visits is called Chili Grove. So, what exactly is this cremation ground? What kind of a place is it? I think it might be quite good just to paint a bit of a picture, because as English people, I mean, in the book they're called cemeteries. Which doesn't really help, because as English people, a cemetery is rather a quaint little place around the back of a church. But the places that Padmasambhava visited were absolutely huge. I mean, I think some of them would be the size of a small city. Enormous places. And only a small section of that place would be the actual cremation area. These cemeteries were also sort of charnel grounds. So Bhante Sangharakshita gives a really great talk about the cremation grounds, actually, dating back to 1971. And he gives a very vivid picture of these cremation grounds. I'm sort of just using that, actually, at the moment. These cemeteries were also sort of charnel grounds. So not every body that went there not every dead body that went to this place would be burnt. Some of them would just be taken there and left to sort of naturally rot or be eaten by vultures and hyenas or whatever it is that they have in India that eats dead bodies. And so this vast area would be littered with dead bodies in various states of decay. Then there would be a cremation area, and there'd be all sorts of, creatures. So they become a kind of a very distinctive place in the imagination. If you wanted to become deeply acquainted with the reality of impermanence, then what better place to go than such a place as this, where you can see what happens to the human body after we die. And so Padmasambhava went to 8 different cremation grounds during the course of this story. And they're all described in some detail in this book. And they've got a number of features that they share in common. So each one of them will have its own stupa. So each of the cemeteries has its own stupa with its own distinctive name and character. Each cemetery will have a tree, a particular tree that has its own name. And then a watery aspect to the cremation ground will be described. And of course, the fiery aspect, the actual cremation part of the cemetery is described. And then there's always a wind, a particular wind that is associated with that particular cremation ground. And every cremation ground will have a king somewhere in some dark corner. It will have a king installed who presides over a mountain of precious jewels. And there will also be a crowd of Dakinis or Darkinis and some monsters, yakshas. So every single cremation ground has got these particular features, all in their own kind of particular personality and character. So Padmasambhava will go to each of these cremation grounds and he'll go up to the tree or the stupa and he will sit with his back against that tree or stupa and he will meditate and he will contemplate. And he also taught the Darkinis. He danced with the Darkinis and he taught the Dharma to the Darkinis. So these Darkinis are kind of wild, abandoned female sort of deities who inhabit the cremation ground. And I suppose, in a way, Padmasambhava is kind of training himself to tame these wild spirits as part of his bodhisattva sort of training. And in his talk about the cremation grounds, Bhante sort of emphasizes that it's got a very particular kind of atmosphere to it. So when you go there, like I think he'd been to some places like that when he was in India. When you go to such a place, there's a sort of like a quivering in the air, and you're very conscious of the numberless dead people who've been brought to that place. So it's kind of haunted by their ghosts. So when you're in this, when you're in the cremation ground, you're really becoming aware of other realities than the sort of ordinary everyday reality. So in a way, for Padmasambhava to go to the cremation ground, have from this extremely pampered and luxurious, very comfortable life in the palace, it was going to the other extreme. And I think you could see that there's a parallel with maybe the heath that King Lear goes to in Shakespeare's play, or or the storm at sea that is described in the Tempest. It's a place that you go to either willingly or unwillingly to be transformed. And it's a very elemental space. So I know that Amarachandra was talking about the stupa last week, and the stupa sort of contains those 4 elements of earth, water, fire, and air. And, the human body is made up of those elements, and it kind of holds them in a kind of stable relationship. But when you go to the cremation ground, you become aware, very sort of brutally, that is only a temporary situation. In the cremation ground, the elements are being kind of released. The winds are whirling, the fires are blazing and burning up human bodies. The water is flowing. And so you're kind of entering into this wild, transmogrifying, elemental space. I thought I could read you a description of one of the cremation grounds, just so that you get a flavour of it. I hope I won't be giving you nightmares. Now there is, in the land of Nepal, the cemetery, many mounds self-formed, being 4.5 leagues in perimeter. In the centre is the stupa, called Mount of the Split-Lip Birds, a dwelling of the great Lamia Kashmali. In the south is the great tree of the tombs, the yellow one, where the croaking of many sorts of funereal birds resounds. In the west is the lake with sugarcane from the water of the tombs, haunted by a quantity of sepulchral creatures. In the north is the cremation fire, crackling, and in the crowds of the fire are larvae having the body of men and the heads of goats, sheep, dogs, cats, swine, birds. There is also every kind of white and red skeleton. In the east is the obituary wind, which turns and swirls, and in the wind a number of ghouls brandishing skeletons. In the northeast, the king of the mountain of the tombs, perfumed with incense, hides among the shelters of many creatures of the tombs, a treasure of miraculous gems. In the southwest, the flashing cloud of the airy regions, head of thunder and body of lightning, lifts with 2 hands heaps of men and fire, obscured by skeletons, skins, and pulverized organs. In the southeast is the Yaksha mare's mouth, with the body of a man, the head of an ass, and the wings of a bird, who vomits tigers, wolves, and other wild beasts. On his bow he adjusts bamboo arrows, and his whole red body is covered with tamed vultures. Now in this great, terrible cemetery, where he lived for 5 years, Padma made the wheel of the Dharma turn for the Darkinis. In the castle of the Yakshas, he subdued the 8 classes of gnomes with plague. He reduced the 3 worlds. He subjugated the 3 domains and received the name of Senge Dredog. So it's a bit like we're in the genre of horror, really, aren't we? Basically, I suppose it's kind of scary, but it's energizing, and it's kind of reality, sort of writ large, and that's where Padmasambhava trained to become a great bodhisattva. So, I suppose there's actually an explanation in this text as to why it is that Padmasambhava needs to spend this time in the cemeteries. So after he leaves the cemetery of Chili Grove, he actually finds himself a teacher, Ananda, in fact, no less. I'm not quite sure exactly how it all works time-wise, but anyway. Ananda sort of teaches enables Padmasambhava to learn various arts. So he learns astrology, mathematics, linguistics, and various crafts as part of his training. And he's kind of initiated into religious knowledge by Ananda. And Ananda explains that the Buddha, in fact, had hidden many of his teachings in the cremation ground because the teachings are kind of much less likely to be watered down in the cremation grounds. So I think what Ananda is emphasizing is that if we sort of stay in these kind of comfortable, safe, reasonable, rational places, then the real power of the Dharma and the Buddha's teaching can easily sort of get watered down, or we just kind of, we become a bit numb to it. So the Buddha intentionally sort of hides his teachings in these kind of desperate places because that's where they're going to actually remain intact. So in some ways, remember this was written in the 14th century about a bodhisattva who emerged in the 8th century, and the Buddha, and I was talking earlier about this wheel-turning monarch that people were dimly aware of in the land of Udayana, and that was Ashoka, who reigned in the 2nd century BC, and then the Buddha was however many years before that. I'm not very good at maths. But we're rolling back many, many, many years. And that the Dharma, in order to sort of survive, has to be hidden. This is a real strong aspect of Tibetan Buddhism, that the Dharma needs to be hidden and kept secret in order to stay sort of fresh and new. So how can we then sort of engage with the cremation ground? We don't have such places. I mean, it might be quite fun to spend a night in a cemetery, but we don't have such places. But I think that obviously there's a kind of a psychological aspect to the cremation grounds sort of teachings. And what we learn from these stories and from this myth is that we need to develop the ability to sort of move towards the places inside ourselves as well as outside of ourselves that scare us, that kind of make us feel uncomfortable and challenged. Sometimes we might decide willingly to move in that direction. Maybe going to see a scary film is a willing movement towards that. Or taking on a challenging job, moving away from somewhere where you've been very safe and comfortable, where you feel very familiar, where you think you know who you are. And then sometimes it's important to willingly move out of your comfort zone, especially if you are a Dharma fair, if you've kind of become a Dharma fairer, as I did last year when I got ordained. Ever since I got ordained, I've been thinking, oh goodness, what have I sort of let myself in for? Maybe I'm going to go and spend a bit more time in Estonia. So you kind of get pulled towards places that maybe don't feel very comfortable or very familiar. But there's going to be a teaching there for you. There's going to be learning. And that's kind of what you've signed up for as a Dharma fairer. So there's the willing aspect of it. But then there's also the unwilling. Like sometimes we stay somewhere very, very safe, very, very familiar, but still the demons come and find us out anyway. And so we need to develop the courage and the skill, in a way, to turn towards these difficult and uncomfortable places. And I think that these stories, or the symbolism of the cremation ground, kind of inspires and guides us in that. In his talk, Bhante points out that the cremation grounds represent all the places, psychologically speaking, that we don't want to go to. And he names those as being kind of 4 different kinds. First of all, there's a kind of a terror of death. I was thinking about that. Of course, there's 2 kinds of death, aren't there? I mean, I'm scared of dying, but I'm also scared of spiritual death. And I noticed that during my sort of ordination training. I remember when I went on a very significant retreat a year or so before I got ordained. On the first night of that retreat, I had the most awful nightmares, and I woke up absolutely terrified. In fact, in the middle of the night, I'd sort of fought something off, and somebody who'd been sharing a room with me had sort of had to talk me down. And I do remember waking up feeling really, really spooked. And a little voice inside me said, maybe you should just go home. Maybe this isn't good for you. But another part of me knew that actually the bit that was terrified was my ego, was the part of me that wants me to stay safe, that wanted me to stay sort of conventional. It didn't want me to go to the places that scare me and that kind of help me to grow and to spiritually die. So I decided to sort of hang on in there. And so that's where the teaching comes in, is that actually sometimes when we feel very scared, we're actually on the verge of a breakthrough, spiritually speaking. So in a way, we can develop a kind of, yes, bring it on. Well, what's the worst that can happen kind of attitude? And access the energy that is offered to us in such moments, because these moments have got a lot of energy. You may notice that when you're very comfortable and very safe, sometimes you're very sleepy and lacking in energy. So these terrifying situations offer us energy. So that's the first thing, is this terror of death. The second thing is loneliness, fear of loneliness. And I think that can really be a very strong guiding principle in many people's lives. Again, a Dharma fairer, Padmasambhava is not scared of loneliness. He just goes out there into the howling storm and does what needs to be done. And loneliness is a state of mind. People can be surrounded by friends or be in a marriage or a relationship and be incredibly lonely. So it is a state of mind rather than an objective fact. So again, I think this is a teaching that sort of inspires us to sort of dig under what this fear of loneliness might actually be. And the other great fear, of course, is insanity. And again, actually, we do need to sort of take risks. You know, we do need to sort of just let things go a bit crazy sometimes. So it's good, of course, to have your spiritual friends and teachers on hand. They can enable you to sort of take risks. And yeah, ultimately what we're frightened of is ourselves. The fact that we are aging, we're losing our powers, we're moving into this unknown land alone. There's nothing anybody can do about that. So you might as well equip yourself for the journey, I suppose. And that's what a Dharma life offers. And I think that there's another one that there's another great thing that I think is quite sort of important to recognize, and that is, the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. So whatever there is there in the cremation ground is nothing, that is ordinary everyday reality, much more than your kettle is, in a way, or your duvet. The Buddha taught that, there is suffering. And actually, the more we can turn into it and explore it and examine it and come to terms with it, the more likely we are to find a path out of it. I think that might be it, yeah. Yeah, I think that's it, really.
Just that.
Just that. I think I'll end there.
Wow.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.